All right, today's video we're going to be working on the Germ Fighter or the Biomedical Pong game, however we want to name it, and working through to make sure it works successfully. So if you remember the main things that we said that we want this game to do, we want the white blood cell to be able to move back and forth on the bottom, and you can drag it left and right. The villain, which is the germ, trying to get into the body, when it starts, it's going to move all over the place. If it hits the bottom of the screen, hopefully you can block it with the white blood cell. If not, the game is over. We'll win if we can keep the blood or the germ out of the body for 10 seconds, and we'll lose if it gets in. So let's get set up. Right now, our app looks very blah. There's not much there. But at least things are organized, so we have a top horizontal arrangement with our two labels, score label and timer label. And on the bottom arrangement, we have our start button already created and labeled, reset button created and labeled, and we have this sound on checkbox, which we're going to refer to a couple times, as in we can either have the sound on or click it and have the sound off. So that's what we're going to work on. But today we want to keep it on so that we can make sure that everything is working the way it needs to with the sound feature. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to start getting into the view layer here and getting everything set up. So we're going to scroll down and we're going to add a canvas. Canvas will be found in the, I think it's going to be found here in the drawing and animation. Yep, there it is. So the canvas is a component that's two-dimensional. I'll drag, let me drag that into the right spot. We want it right in between, so it splits the two boxes. Canvas component is a two-dimensional, touch-sensitive, rectangular panel, as you can see. And it's where we can draw, we can move sprites, we can do different things like that. This is where we're going to hopefully have our germ fighter, our white blood cell, keep the villain or the germ out. So now that we have that there, we have to set up the properties. So let's go over to the properties. And the one thing we want to do is we want to make the background color red. And we're going to want to make it a little bigger. So for the height, let's make it 350 pixels. And let's go ahead and make the width fill parent so it fills the whole screen. So as we're doing that, you're probably going to see different things change on your tablet. And we'll refer back to the tablet as we go a couple times. But before we look at our tablet, let's first set up our sprites now as well. So the sprites are also in the drawing and animation. So we're going to drag one germ sprite to the bottom, try to keep it somewhat centered, and keep a little bit of space between the gap of the buttons and the edge of the canvas and where we put the sprite. So again, these sprites are things that can move around on the screen. This one we're going to rename right away, white blood cell sprite. So make sure each word is capitalized in the first letter. White blood cell sprite. Okay. And now we have it labeled properly. The only change we have to make in the properties is in the picture. We're going to use the media that's already been downloaded, and we're going to call this white blood cell PNG. And as soon as I do that, you'll see the germ pop up, and you'll see the germ pop up on my tablet too. If it doesn't look centered like it does right now, it's not a big deal. We can always come back and fix that. All right, now we're going to do a second sprite, and this time we're going to drag the image sprite in the top and put it near the center, and again, give a little bit of a gap. So there's that one. We're going to rename this one Germ Sprite. Germ capital, Sprite capital. And again, this one has its own picture. We're going to call it the germ.png picture. And now we can see we have the two different germs. We don't want to mess with the height or size or anything. The images are already taken care of for us. So that's what the screen looks like. That's how we want everything to look. Now, there's a couple more components we want to put in here, but they're going to be non-visible components. So the first non-visible component we want to pull out is a sound one. And remember, when we pull, this one's going to come from the media drawer. And when we drag the sound, remember, it disappears. So we put it on here, and then it goes down here in the non-visible components. So that's what we want it to do. We want it to kind of sit in the back or in the bottom. We're going to come back to the sound one, and we're going to add different things later. Now, we also want to go into the sensors, which is down here on the left, and we want to drag a clock. We're going to put the clock in here, and I want to talk a little bit about the clock before we move on and check things. So if you look at the clock here, you'll see that we have checkmarked always fires and timer enabled. Always fires means the clock is always going to fire. We're going to want to control our clock a little more. So while we're working on this, let's get rid of the always fires piece. The other thing we're going to notice is this interval, and it says 1,000. Well, what that is that's 1,000 milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds can equal 1 second. So we can adjust this, and we can change the speed at which numbers are going to count down. For example, we see the timer that says 10 here. If we have it all set up properly and I hit start and it starts counting, it's going to go 10, 9, 8, and so on and so on. If I cut this in half, how fast do you think it's going to go? You're right. If I cut that in half, it's going to go twice as fast. If I make it 2,000, then that means it's going to go every 2 seconds on the timer. So you can change this thing and you can adjust it any way possible. For example, what if we wanted the timer to count down by minutes? Well, there's 60 seconds in a minute. So we know we could take this number 1,000 and multiply it by 60. Well, since you're multiplying by a base 10, you add a 0, and 1 times 6 is 6. So that would set up it to go by every 60 seconds, and you'd see the counter time down. Let's just keep it at 1,000 for now, since we're dealing with seconds. All right, let's take a look at our tablet. And now we're looking at this and going, hey, this doesn't look right. It looks like everything kind of got jumbled on me. Now, if this ever happens to you, remember, you can clear the button by closing out the app, scrolling down, oops, wrong app, and clicking on the MIT App Inventor again. On your computer, you can see we got disconnected. We just have to refresh the page, wait for the file to open, and then we will go to Connect and AI Companion. So I like to use the QR code. So right now I am scanning the QR code. You'll know when it's scanned when you see on the screen here a status bar pop up. In the status bar, you don't do anything. You just kind of let it roll, and we can look on our tablet and we'll see it's ready when everything pops back up again. So we're good, and everything's back where it needs to be. Again, we have this white space. Not worried about that. We can fix that later. That's not a big deal. What we're worried about is making this work. All we know we can do with a bigger tablet here is I can just make the pixels bigger. We can play around with that stuff later. It's not that important. Okay. Now, throughout this process, we're going to want to make sure we know what we have to do to get all the tasks completed properly. If you remember, you were shared this event handler. This event handler helps us to keep things organized, and you'll see that each row is a different block of code that we're going to have to create. So if you look on my screen, or your screen, I should say, there are 6 blocks of code that you're going to have to create. Each one of these blocks are going to have to include all the things that are in here. We're going to work through this stuff incrementally, making sure each one of these items on the right get completed. We know we will not be done unless they all get completed. That's important to double check your work. Okay, so the first thing we're going to work on, because it's the first one up here, is the start button. So we want to get the germ to start moving, and eventually later, once we start building the timer, we're going to have to come back and do the timer enabled pieces. So let's get this start button all set up. So go into blocks. We know the start button was created for us already, so we can go down here to the start button, and we're going to get a start button.click. So whenever we click on it, something's going to happen. What we want to be able to set up here is we want to be able to set up so that when we click start, the germ starts moving around. Now, when we touch that start button and the germ starts moving about the screen, the program is set up so that we have 3 things that need to be set up: the speed, the heading, and the interval. So let's talk about those 3 things right now. First, the heading. When you look at your screen, this would be your red background. We need to know that the heading is the property in which the image sprite is going to figure out what orientation it's supposed to be on. So think about this as a big compass that goes in a big circle. Okay. Now you can see that 0 starts in the far right edge, goes down or goes up, down and around, so it goes counterclockwise. Where it's bouncing around based on its heading is what we tell it to move to. So headings, again, go in full circles. And a sprite moving toward the top of the screen is going to be moving towards 90 degrees. A sprite moving to the left of the screen would be 180 degrees. And the bottom would be 270. And then to the right is 0. So we need to be aware of that. That's one of the things that we should note. Now you can also see that if we look at this as a coordinate grid, which we'll have to look at later, the x values are the amount of pixels. They add up to the right, starting at 0 in the top corner. That'd be our origin. And the y values, those pixels, go downward to the bottom. So they get bigger down here, smaller up here, bigger on the right, smaller on the left. Okay? So the other two things we have to set up are the speed and the interval. So the heading, speed, and interval are all going to work together. The speed determines how many pixels the sprite will be able to move each time it's set within the interval on our, let's look at it, on our canvas. The interval determines how often the sprite's going to move within those milliseconds. So that means if the speed is set to 10, the interval is set to 1,000, that the sprite will move 10 pixels for every 1 second in this direction set by the heading property. So that would definitely change if we change the headings and the speed. So let's get this set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the blocks, and we're going to pull a germ sprite, heading, speed, and interval. We're going to set them. So we need to get the green set for heading. And I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit here. So I'm going to drag the germ sprite heading in. And then I'm going to do a Control C and a Control V. It copies it. I'm going to do it one more time. Instead of going and searching for this box 3 times, we can just go and change the heading to speed and interval. Okay, now that we have these set, what we have to do is start putting the math drawer, math blocks in there. So the speed, we're going to set that at, let's say we're going to set it lower so that we can practice with this. And once we get really good with it, then we can change the app to be faster and more challenging. So I'm going to set it at 9. That just means it's going to move at that speed of 9. Now, the interval we want to set at 10. So it's going to move at that 10 interval. So let's drag that in there and change it to 10. Now the heading, we want to have a little fun with this and allow that it's not always going to start in the same exact spot. We want the germ to be able to bounce off in different directions when you start it, not just go right every single time. We want it to have different integers, random integers. So we're going to go into the math, and we're going to pull a random integer from 1 to 100. So we can always change the numbers, and actually let's change these numbers to be 30 and 150. Okay. So now it's going to bounce around in different directions. So what I want to ask you here is, if I push the start button, what are we going to observe? What do you think is going to happen before I even do anything? Always kind of interesting to think about that. Well, let's take a look. If I hit start, you see it moves to the right. I hit start, kind of jiggles, or it wiggles, or it goes to the left, or just spins. These are all the random headings that it's set at. Okay? So what we're noticing here is the sprite is changing direction since it's getting a random value for a heading every single time. And that's okay. We're going to eventually get that thing to work a little better. And one of the things we want to do is we want to make sure that the germ sprite can go back to its original spot every single time. So let's just hit reset. See anything change? No. So that means that's going to have to be the second block that we're going to start working on. So right now we have the germ moving. That's what we want to have. So I'm going to highlight that yellow. Now let's go on the reset button, and let's make sure we can get the germ position back at rest. That's the next thing we're going to work on. I'm going to make it yellow because we will get it done. All right. So let's pull in the reset button, and we're going to do a reset.click, something really simple. Okay. And on the reset button, what we want to do is we want to start getting things set up. So let's get that reset button to get our germ sprite to be back where it needs to be. So what we're going to do is we're going to use go to germ sprite, and we're going to use a move to. We want to have it set to go to where it needs to move to. So on the reset button, we're going to call it to move to. And what we want to do is we want to think about, again, our canvas as a coordinate grid. So in our coordinate grid, remember we have the x's that go across and the y's. To find the middle, what we want to do is figure out whatever the total x is and cut it in half. So we're going to use a division block for this one. Let's see if we can find it. There it is. And what we'll have it start out with is wherever the canvas is set at, we're going to figure out whatever the canvas width is. If we use this little box down here that says canvas width, it is basically going to start out the entire width. So let's say the width is 100 or 500 or 200. It doesn't matter, but we know that the total will be here. What we want to do is cut that in half. So we're going to use a number, and we're just going to split it in half so that the germ sprite always goes to the middle. Now, as far as its coordinates from the top down, let's put it about 30 pixels down. That seems like a good number to use. So we're going to just take a math logic. We're going to drop it in here, and we're going to change it to 30. Okay. So now our reset button is getting stuff done. So if we look at that, we're set now with at least it going back to the starting position. So after we get our reset kind of moving here, we'll see the germ sprite show up somewhere around the middle. The other thing we might as well fix right away too is the speed and the heading. So we're going to copy the speed. Oops. Control C. Control V. We're going to control the speed. Oh, not down here. We want to put that in the reset button. We'll want the speed at 0. We don't want it to move when we reset the button. And we'll want to do the same thing with the heading. So I can use the same box. And all I have to do now is change the speed to heading and make it 0. So now it should move to the center and not have anything adjust. That's the hope. Let's see if it works that way. So we go here and we hit reset. Look what happens. Our germ sprite goes right to the center. We'll see that our white blood cell is not exactly center, but really that's not a big deal right now. We'll get to that. Okay, let's keep moving. Now let's talk about the white blood cell behavior. So if we look at our biomedical Pong, we want to make sure that the white blood cell will drag. We want to be able to move the finger back and forth. So that's what we're going to work on now. So what we want to do is we want to get the white blood cell to have a move to as well, just like the germ sprite. It's going to be a little simpler though. So I'm going to grab the white blood cell and we're going to do a drag. And we've done drag before with other things. So now what we want to do is we want to get a move to. So we're going to go to the white blood cell. And where do we want it to move to? Well, we want the X to move. What's this? Click off. We want the X to move to its current. So let's get current X. And the Y, we don't want it to move around, so we just want the white blood cell sprite to always be aware of where the Y is and stationary. So we're going to go into here to white blood cell, and we're going to pull the white blood cell sprite.y. Basically saying, we don't care about that, we just want the X to be there. So now, we should be able to notice that the white blood cell will move right, left, right, left. Perfect. That's what we wanted to do to protect the germ from getting in the body. So if that's it, that's all we need to do with it, because we only had the one line, we are now completely done with the white blood cell sprite. So let's completely highlight this section. Okay. Now we're moving. Now we're cooking with peanut oil. Let's get into colliding with the canvas and dealing with the next one, which is reaching the edge. Now, if we look here, in our edge, we're going to have if statements. So that means that we're going to have if then else, conditional statements, We're going to have to use those here. Now, before we get going, we know we're going to be talking about the edges. Take a look at all the edges. The right edge is 3, the left is -3, and so on and so on. We don't want the germ to go to the bottom. So what edge is the bottom? You'll see -1 there. And that's what I put in our germ sprite right now is -1. So what we need to do is we need to set up that if the edge hits the bottom, game's over. Timer we'll worry about once we get a timer set. And that checkbox, if it's checked, the sound's going to play. And then if it hits any other edge, we just want it to bounce. So let's get what we can set up. Basically everything but the timer. Here we go. We're going to start out by getting ourselves a germ sprite dot edge. Let's go that simple. So we go up here to start. We always start with one of these. Edge reached. There we go. And what we want to do is we want to have our conditional statement, if then else. So we're going to put the if then else statement in here. And we are going to first set up the if edge equals -1. So with this one, I need a logic of equal. Let's see, do we have an equal? There it is. So we're going to, again, want to reach the edge. So I'm going to grab this little thing that says edge, highlight over it and move it. And the edge that we don't want to hit is -1. But if we do, we have to do something different. So we're going to do -1. So what happens? Well, remember, we have to get the germ to stop moving. So we want to get the germ sprite speed to be at 0. Germ sprite speed. Oh, come on, get in there. There we go. We're going to set that to 0 so that it can't move. We lost. Once it hits the bottom, we don't need that germ bouncing around anymore. We know we lost. And now we're going to want to set the canvas to have a different background. So we're going to go to canvas and we're going to get our background image. Now for the background image, there's a media item already created down here that says gameover.png. Be aware the G is capital and the O is capital. So we have to put this in exactly the way it is. So we're going to go to text and we're going to put in the background image game over, all one word, .png. Make sure you type that properly. So now, if it reaches the bottom, we're going to hear a sound, or we're going to get the game over piece. The background's going to change. But the other thing we have to be aware of is the germ bouncing on the other ends. So if it doesn't hit -1, it's just going to keep bouncing. So I'm going to hit germ sprite, and I'm going to find a call germ sprite bounce edge. There it is. And what do we want it to do? Well, if it reaches any other edge, it's just going to bounce off the edge. So let's just get edge. Okay. So now this is set up to work exactly how we want it to. And it's going to be able to bounce around. Let's show you. If I hit start and it bounces, it says game over. But we have it check marked. So now we have to make sure we go back in and we add the sound. Now, the sound is only going to happen if it hits the edge. So we're going to use an if-then statement, but we're only going to put that if-then statement within the then box. So our first thing is we want to see if the sound box is checked. So over here on the left, I'm going to grab sound box checked. Okay, make sure it's the one that has the shape that matches properly. So if the sound box check is on, then we're going to have to call the source to play in the sound. So we're going to set the sound source, and it's going to play the sound that is created for us. So we need the text box, and then we need to put in what the source is called down here in the media. It's lose.wav. So we got to make sure it's capital L, OSE.wav. Now that's only going to play when we hit the bottom. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I hit and the play again that it calls it to play. Because right now it won't play unless I say call play. Okay. So now it should be good to go. It should be able to play, and if we have the check mark on there, it will play. So let's go back to our tab here. We see it still says game over, but now if I hit start, So that works exactly how we want it to. But here's the problem. As we're testing it, do you realize the screen, if I hit reset, our germ goes back, but our screen is still the same way. So what we need to do, as we see here in the Biomedical Pong, is we have to reset the background image. So let's do that. Let's reset the background image. All we have to do is go back to the reset button. And now that we have created something, we'll just slide this over a little bit. We're going to go to Canvas, background image, and we're going to drop that into the reset button. Now, we don't have a specific title for the background image, so all we have to do is go to the text, grab an empty text box. That's the specific background we want. What do we mean? Well, there's no title for it like this one, so now if I hit reset, now we're back to red. So the reset is something we always want to go back to make sure we're checking things off. Okay, let's go back to our event handler and see how we did with the germ sprite reaching. We got it reaching -1. We got that done, so we can turn that yellow. We got the game over to display and the sound to check. The only thing we didn't do was the timer, which we'll have to do when we get to the timer part. Okay? So now if we look, the next box we have is when the germ sprite collides. So part of the game is this germ sprite hitting the white blood cell. If we try it now, you see it misses every time. We have to program it to be able to hit each other. So let's program it to hit each other. So I'm going to put another box in here, and we are going to start with a germ sprite colliding. Since that's the one that's going to be doing the moving, that's the one we want to collide. And there it is, when collides with. So I'm going to put that down there. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the germ sprite's heading. It should be able to move, again, the entire circle. So what's the largest number of the entire circle? 360. So what we have to do is we have to get the germ sprite heading. We've done that before. Germ sprite heading. Click that in there. Come on, bud. There we go. And what we're going to do is we're going to remember that we want the germ sprite to be able to go 360 minus whatever heading it's set at. So we're going to go into a math logic and find a subtraction. There it is. And what we want to do is we want to set the math to be, it has the possibility of hitting the entire circle. So it could be at 360, and then subtract it from where it's actually set right now. So we need to subtract it from wherever the specific heading is right now. So we'll go here to germ sprite heading. Remember, we need this one that has the puzzle piece shape that fits. And there we go. So now the germ sprite is sitting exactly where it needs to. So similar to what we did with the lose wave sound file, we're going to have to add a collision sound file, since we have one of those created for our germ sprite when it reaches the white blood cell. But remember, it only plays if the sound check mark is clicked. So we have to do an if-then statement, because we don't want it to happen all the time, just when it's clicked. So we'll do the if-then, and remember we have the button here. I know I'm moving the screen around. Sorry about that. Check on, checked. Sound box checked on, checked. So if the sound is on, then we're going to be able to have the sound play. So again, we're going to have to pull, and I'm just going to scroll up a little bit. We want to pull the sound thing, Control C, Control V. The difference is this one has a different name down here in the media. It's collision.wav. So again, we have to type it exactly as is. C, capital C, OLLISION.wav. And then we have to call the sound to play. This is the exact same thing, so we're going to copy it from before, and we're going to put it in there. So now it's working perfectly. Let's see. Hit reset, start. You see it clicks. It's making the sound. That's perfect. If I turn the sound off and I reset it and I start, we don't hear anything. That's perfect. So I'm going to click the sound on, though. Now remember, as we talked about in the expectations of the game, if the two collide, you're supposed to score a point. So now we have to go in and we have to program the point. But before we do that, let's go to our Biomedical Pong here and see what we have for the white blood cell colliding. We have the germ bouncing, and that's it. Oh no, we have the collision sound playing as well. Now we have to get the update. We have to get the score to work, and we have to make sure that we also make the label updated so that also displays itself up here when the score is created. So down to the germ sprite. Now we are going to go outside the if-then box because we always want it to score points whenever they collide. So we need to create an initial globalization, and what this does is this allows for variables to be set at a specific number. Whenever they're set at this number, this is what it's always going to be, unless you program it differently. So we're going to use lowercase, so we don't have to worry about it. We're going to initialize the global score. Now, what do we want the score to be at when you start the game? We want it to be at 0, because if we look up here, score equals 0. So once we have the score initialized, now we can grab a get variable, or a set variable, and we're going to set the variable for score. Now, what we want it to do is we always want it to go up by 1. So we learned about the variables and following the flow chart that every time you do a new step or a new bounce or a new point, it always has to go up by 1. So we're going to look for a math thing of +1. And what we're always going to start with here is the global score, because we know the score will change throughout the game. So if you had 6 points, +1 would give you 7. If you had 2 points, +1 would give you 3, and so on. But since we start the game out at 0, 0 plus 1 would give you 1. So we're going to go up +1. If you really wanted to, you could change how many points the game gives you. You could say every time the germ sprite collides with the white blood cell, you could give yourself 4 points. It really doesn't matter. So that's one part. But now we have to update the actual label. So when we do score points, it's going to show the label there as well. Otherwise, you'll never see what's going on. So I'm going to go to the score label, and I'm going to want to change the text. So score label.text. And if you look at the, come on, get in there. If we look at the label, there's actually 2 parts here. There's the word score and there's the number. So because there's 2 parts, we want to go into the text and grab a join box. The join box is going to be able to allow us to do 2 or more things if you want to join them together. For us, we're going to join the text of score with the colon, and it's capital, so capital S-C-O-R-E, colon. And the other part that we're going to have is it's always going to connect with the global score, whatever the score currently is. So we're going to get a get, and we're going to have it be global score. So now that we look at that, we can now see that the score should be set up properly, and the only way we're going to know if it works is if we test it. So let's go back over here, and let's play our game, and as we start, we should see the score change. So look at this part of the screen as I play, not my terrible playing of the game. Yeah, see what I mean? Okay. Oh, here we go. So you see how the score goes up? And every time I play, the score goes up, but it didn't change. That's because when I click reset, I haven't changed the score yet. So that's the next thing I have to change. I'm going to let myself lose. There we go. So now that this is set up right, let's go back to the event handler. We have the score going up, the score updates. This part is completely done. But now we have to, oops, wrong color. Now we have to go to the reset button, and we have to reset the score variable and the label. So let's go and make sure we take care of that. I'm going to highlight it because I know we'll get it done here. So go back up here to the reset button. And what we want to do in the reset button is we want to add 2 changes. One, we got to get the global score again. We got to set the global score. And why is that? Because every time we reset the game, we want to reset the score back to 0. So we have to let it know to reset the score back to 0. And the other thing we have to update is the score label. So let's find a score label.text. Let's put that in there as well in the reset. And we're going to reset the score to the way the label originally looked. Ooh, missed my mouse there. And the original label was capital S, score, colon, space, 0. That's what we started with. Now if I go to the screen and I hit reset, just like the screen will turn to red, watch the score up here. Back to 0. And the score is also set back to 0, so if I hit start, you'll see that the score again starts from 0 and not some other number. Okay, I'll turn the sound off for that, and I'll click reset. Fantastic. We're getting a great amount done here today. So we have the score updated now in the reset button. So the reset button we'll keep going back to. Now, if I look at the things we have on the screen, we have the timer that has to be set in the start button. We have to reset the timer and, of course, the label too. We have to make sure we change that. We'll have to disable the clock in the reset so it doesn't constantly run. We have to disable the timer when it's in the germ sprite when they collide, if it collides at -1. And we have to set up the entire timer. So I think now we're down to the timer part. So let's get working on that. Now, you're supposed to be able to follow the flow chart properly to be able to know how to do this. I'm going to walk you through it so we can get this completed well, and it will be successful for you. This is one of those codes that when we're done doing it, you may want to slide into your backpack for later projects. Wink, wink. All right, let's get working on this. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go into the clock, and we're going to have to pull out the clock.timer. We want the clock to run as a timer, so that's what we're going to put down here. We also need to initialize the time of the game. So I'm going to go to variables, and I'm going to initialize goal. And this one, we're going to initialize with the name of time. I'm going to do it lowercase, left, capital L-E-F-T. And the time left to start the game at should be 10 seconds. If you want to change it later, you can, but right now we're going to say we just want to fight off that germ sprite for 10 seconds. All right, now that we have that set up, let's look at the Pong here, and it says that the first thing we have to do is decrement the score. So we have to get it to go down. We have to subtract the math of the global score -1, so we can go down by 1 second every time down to 10 seconds. Update the timer label, and then we have a whole bunch of if statements. If it equals 0, we know the game's over. We're going to have a successful page change where it says win. We're going to play the sound if the sound box is checked, so we have to use that if then again. Make the germ stop moving and disable that timer. So here we go. First thing I want us to do is get a global time left. So let's set the global time. And we're going to set that global time by the total time -1, because again, it's going to go down by 1. So we're going to put the math there. In variables, we're going to get time left. Okay, that's because I'm hooked up. No big deal. Yours may do that too. You can just ignore it. And the time left will be -1. So every second is going to tick off. Tick, 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 all the way down to 0. Thank goodness we don't have a sound for that too. So now that we have that time left, we also have to set up the label. So let's set up our timer label, .text. And this is going to have two things, remember. Our timer has the word timer and the time that's counting down. So we need the two different things. So we have to join. We're going to join the label that says timer with the colon, capital T for timer, colon, and it's going to be joined with the time left, whatever the globalization is. I got it fixed, don't worry. Now, if I look at our event handler, we've decremented the time and we updated the label. So I'm going to check those off. Now we have that word if, so that means we're going to have to put a conditional statement of if, then. There's no else here, it's just if it hits 0. So I'm going to go up into the control and I'm going to grab an if, then, and I'm going to drop it in here. And again, if timer equals 0, So we need to make sure that we grab a equals box, and it would be the global time. If the global time equals 0, then we know something's going to happen. So what we need to do is we have to have the background image of the canvas. So canvas.background image. It's going to play the other label that we have for it. So we're going to need a text box. And the text box is going to say, in the media, uwin.png with a capital Y and a capital W. uwin.png. That's cool. We'll have a different screen pop up when we have that work. Now, since we created the timer, I just want to point out something, and maybe you see this on yours too. Time's ticking away. Okay? It is past 0, but that's because we didn't tell the timer to stop. We'll eventually do that. But it is kind of cool to see it actually starting to work. The other thing we want to have besides just you win is we also want to make sure that the sprite stops moving, the germ sprite. So we have to set the germ sprite speed to what to make it stop moving. If you're thinking 0, that's the right number. So let's get that germ sprite to get to 0 so it stops moving around, since we just finished the game and we won. So now that should work perfectly. And if I hit start, it's going to start to move around, but the timer's already passed, so we don't see it saying that we won. We're going to have to fix that in a little bit in the reset button. But we do need to also set the sound. Now remember, we've done the sound a couple times, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this sound box up here, and I'm going to copy, I'm going to paste. And I want to bring that sound box down to the clock. And remember, it goes in the then section. So if then it has to sit in the then section. Only if we have the sound box checked will the sound play that we won. The sound for winning is win with a capital W .wav. So I don't have to get rid of all of it, just the word collision to be win. Okay? So that will only play if we have the button, the sound check mark clicked. Now we have to get the clock to stop. So how are we going to get this clock to stop? Well, if you remember back in the designer page, the one thing I told you to keep clicked with the clock was timer enabled. So what we need to do now is we need to go down to the clock and we have to find timer enabled. So we're going to set the timer enabled to be set at false. And again, the reason why we use false is like no. Do we want the timer to be enabled? No, we want it disabled. Now here's where positioning is so important. If I put the clock here, it's always going to stop the clock. So we're going to start the clock and it's always going to run and then stop right away. It's going to be, hey, you want me to stop it? So this is another one of those that goes in the then box. It can't go in the if then sound check, it goes outside of it. So now if we take a look at our tablet, the clock has officially stopped. We found a way to make it stop. And we are only 272 seconds too late. So we have our timer set perfectly. The timer is working the way it needs to. It stopped everything. We're looking really good right now. But now the only other thing we have to do is fix up all these timer pieces. Let's go back to the start button, because here we have to actually have the timer start. So let's go to the start button up at the top. And we're going to add one more to the start button, since that's what it says. We're going to go to that clock, and we're going to get it to start. So we're going to have to go to clock, and we're going to go down to timer enabled. And this is the only place where we want to make sure that it says we want the timer to be enabled to true, because now we know that it's actually running. So here it's saying timer enabled true. That is correct. Okay. So if I go here and if I want to check it, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit start. And the clock started running, right? But why does it keep running? Because it's going to keep running until I hit 0. Well, we're past 0, so it's going to keep running. So the only thing I can do now to stop this is I have to go into reset and be able to stop it. But reset didn't stop it either, right? You know why? Hopefully you should recognize now we haven't programmed that yet. So let's do that. I know the start button is working correctly, but I can't check it off until I know for sure. So let's go into the reset timer, and we're going to have to set the timer to be disabled. So that means enable.false. And then we're going to reset that timer label exactly how we did the score label. Okay. So the score label, we had to reset the global score and the score label to say that. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to Control C, Control V. I'm going to change not the score label, but the time left to be at what? What do we start the game at again? 10 seconds. But remember, the label also has to be reset as well. So we're going to copy and paste the score label, and we're just going to change it to timer label, and then change our name here from score to timer, and make sure it's set at 10 seconds. So now, when I click reset, I should be good to go. Let's double check. Reset. Our score changed and our timer changed. But what do we not have changed? The timer is continuing to run. So what we have to do still, it hit 0. So now we're good. And we can see that we had it set up that when it does hit, when we do win, it did stop. So that is working. That's a good sign. That means that we did complete our programming properly down here on the bottom. So that's why that's okay. So let's go ahead and go into the reset button, and let's go ahead and disable the clock. So remember, we go to clock, and then we go to timer enabled, and we're going to set it to false. False should be the correct answer for this, because then it won't run. And that's what we want it to do. We don't want it to run. So if we look at this, we'll see that it's working properly, and we will continue on. Okay, now the big check is to see if the start button works. So I'm going to go and show our tablet and hit reset. And when I click start, watch the timer. It should start counting down. And it did, except I'm not good at the game. All right, now it's counting down. Everything's working the way it's supposed to. Let's see if when I finish the game, it still is at 0. Good. It's at 0. Reset. What's going to happen, though, if I lose? So I did it. It's still running. So if you remember back on our event handler, we still have one more here where we have to set the timer to be disabled. So let's do that. We're going to have to go to when the germ sprite reaches the edge. So germ sprite edge, we have to set the timer to stop here in the then statement. So go down here to clock, timer enabled. We'll put it in the then statement, and then we just have to set it to false so that it stops. Now let's reset the game and lose and make sure the clock stops. Okay, click start. Let it fall. Clock stops now. So if we again look at our event handler, we have now completed everything we were expected to make this app work successfully. Everything is working the way it needs to, and we have a successful app. Nice job. So if you've gotten to this point, great. I'm proud of you. Glad you're able to do everything. Check it off with myself or your teacher, and then you're going to have to go and complete your conclusion questions in your notebook. And that's it for this lesson.